Again, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. Today, more on human desire, the idea of a return to infantile consciousness, and the role reason plays in lifting us all up to a better life. You might remember we've been looking lately at this dialogue of Plato, the Phaedrus, in particular his myth of the soul, his myth, if you like, of human consciousness. And last time, you might remember, we found something really quite striking, perhaps in a way even kind of mind-blowing about this myth, in that its depiction of souls in heaven, of consciousness, that is to say, in its purest state, reminded us strikingly of states from very early human development, from early infancy or before our birth, before we learned to objectify, to do that distinguishing of self from other that is necessary to reasoning, perhaps in a way even identical to reasoning. And when in an inexpressible and really unimaginable way, I think, we were in a way at one with everything. Similarly, Plato's souls in heaven, some of them anyway, or some of them especially, don't seem to have experienced alienation in any way, either from the cosmos or themselves. We gazed in rapture at sacred revealed objects that were perfect and simple and unshakable and blissful. Socrates tells Phaedrus of this primal state of the more fortunate souls in heaven, the state of, you could say, communion with the truth or communion with ultimate reality. That was the ultimate vision, and we saw it in pure light because we were pure ourselves. And then we looked at how Plato describes the human psyche in its current fallen, embodied state as having these kinds of flashbacks, these, if you like, these moments of being triggered by ecstatic encounters with beauty that unconsciously remind it of this buried memory, the beauty it beheld in its primal state. When we saw that, we couldn't help think, among other things, of Freud's speculation that the ecstatic experiences attested by his friend Romain Rolland, these oceanic experiences, were really nothing other than memory states, the surfacing of buried memories of the existential unity we lived at these very earliest stages of our lives. And we might even have wondered if Plato's myth was trying to say more or less the same things in different words, that ecstasy can be understood as a memory state, a coming to mind of a buried memory of existential oneness from our infancy or even before, maybe from our time in the womb. Of course, there's just one problem with this interpretation of Plato's myth, and that is that in the myth, the memory that embodied souls are trying to recover isn't simply a memory of feeling, a memory of a state before thought. In fact, it's hard to imagine anyway how this would even be possible, whether we could be said to be able to remember a time when we didn't think at all, given that remembering and thinking are so intertwined as to seem, in a way, kind of indistinguishable. And they all kind of involve this element, they both involve this element of abstraction and being an other, being a self to the other, even if the other is a mental object. Anyway, souls in the pre-fallen state that Socrates describes do not seem to lack anything. There's nothing in the myth to suggest, that they're pre-rational. They're depicted as already whole and complete. And that's why their quest in this life is to recover their heavenly state, not to get beyond it in some way. This just doesn't match up with the story of natural human life. in which the capacity to think is something we lack at the beginning and develop over time. When we look at this myth, we see that it is about anything but a desire to return to a pre-rational state, actually. Quite the contrary, for Plato, reason plays an essential role in restoring consciousness to its full integrity, to a state of harmony with itself. We saw a couple of episodes ago how for Plato these flashbacks we experience to some kind of memory of a primeval beauty or oneness give us an incredible lift. It's as though we all have a kind of inverse PTSD, and he depicts beauty as a kind of trigger that, instead of engendering anxiety and self-dividedness, like a buried and untreated memory of trauma, kicks it into a kind of ecstatic state, a unitive state. But these memories of primal beauty, when experienced only as memories, serve only to bewilder the psyche, which of course has the potential to lead it into more self-division. Of those who recollect what they saw in heaven, Socrates tells Phaedrus, quote, "They are startled when they see an image of what they saw up there. They are beside themselves, and their experience is beyond their comprehension because they cannot fully grasp what it is they are seeing." So then how does the psyche get beyond this state of mere bewilderment to healing and growth, to a recovery, to put it platonically, of its former state? On some level, we're told this happens when we resist the temptation to objectify the beautiful, to make it an objective, and instead open ourselves up to it, make ourselves radically open to it by understanding that what we seek is not the beautiful as an object, but the beauty itself that that object embodies and communicates, and it's a beauty that we want to be ultimately one with. One whose memory of heavenly things is dim, Socrates says, quote, is not to be moved abruptly from here to a vision of beauty itself when he sees what we call beauty here. So instead of gazing at the latter reverently, in other words, in communion with it, he surrenders to pleasure and sets out in the manner of a four-footed beast, eager to make babies. But those with a stronger memory of heaven, he continues, revere the beautiful as though it were a god. They see it as something to worship, to commune with, something that speaks of another world than the subject-object one. This opening up, Socrates continues, sets the psyche on a path to vitality and growth. Now, it's true that Socrates describes this process in some ways as unconscious. It's one that takes place seemingly without effort on our part, on some level, as though it were a matter of receptivity alone. A stream of beauty from the beloved, he says, pours into the lover through his eyes, quote, warms him up and waters the growth of his wings. Meanwhile, the heat warms him and melts the places where the wings once grew, places that were long ago closed off with hard scabs to keep the sprouts from coming back. But as nourishment flows in, the feather shafts swell and rush to grow from their roots beneath every part of the soul. So growth through warming, melting, softening, and sort of breaking down of what has become rigid. It's an image that speaks maybe of psychological, spiritual, psychic, if you like, growth through the letting go of rigid assumptions we make, the letting go of the breaking down of hardness, the letting go of fixed assumptions, not just about abstract topics, but about ourselves and others. Assumptions perhaps that negate in some way ourselves and others. I mean, fixed and perhaps unwarranted negative judgments both about ourselves and others. So we can see how this inner softening would mean the growth of psychic wings, the ability, a new ability of the psyche to rise to a better life, and how Eros and an openness to beauty, perhaps inner beauty most of all, would be essential to this. Wanting to emphasize the point, I think, Socrates recites a couple of lines of poetry about the god Eros to Phaedrus, which he, I think tongue-in-cheek, says are from the lesser-known work of Homer. Mortals call him winged Eros, but the immortals call him pteros, which means winged, as in, the pterodactyl with the silent P in English. Because he must grow wings. Mortals call him winged Eros, but the immortals call him pteros, because he must grow wings. It's the nature of Eros, Plato is telling us, to raise human consciousness in this way. Still, the process in this particular metaphor of wing growth comes across here as essentially passive, as the psyche being worked on from without, doesn't it? And yet, on the other hand, we can't help but notice that elsewhere in this passage, Socrates' second speech, repeated mentions of the presence of philosophy at work in those who are thus transformed by Eros and beauty. Having returned to his earlier image of the chariot to depict the conflicting elements in the human psyche, Socrates says of lover and beloved, if the victory goes to the better elements in both their minds, which lead them to follow the assigned regimen of philosophy, the life here below is one of bliss and shared understanding. So clearly philosophy, rationality, and effort of the mind play a role in this return of the psyche to its primeval and pure state, to its self-reintegration. But what is that role? Well, I think we have a hint in what I mentioned earlier, that beauty triggers in us a kind of anti-trauma. Just as the psychotherapy of today works by raising the unconscious to consciousness, the psychotherapeutic philosophy of Plato enables the psyche to move beyond this initial stage of bewilderment that I spoke of earlier, to that contemplation of beauty that is the ultimate object of Eros, by jogging its memory, by helping it articulate what that ultimate object is, even if that ultimate object is also, in a way, sort of ultimately beyond speech, it can still help point to it. And this is because philosophy works out the relation of good or beautiful things to the absolute good or beautiful. It traces all things to their cause, and the ultimate cause of everything, of course, is the good, or the one, or the absolute beautiful. You might remember a bit earlier in this passage, Socrates tells Phaedrus, quote, "A human being must understand speech in terms of general forms, proceeding to bring many perceptions together into a reasoned unity. That process is the recollection of the things our soul saw when it was traveling with God. A man who uses reminders of these things correctly is always at the highest, most perfect level of initiation, and he is the only one who is perfect as perfect can be. Through philosophy, we build a system that brings everything under the good or one or absolutely beautiful. shows everything in its relation to these principles, or if you like, this principle, as all of these are in some way ultimately the same, the good, the one, the beautiful. It's this knowledge that will help us, as Socrates says, use reminders of these principles correctly, to use these beautiful objects as a spur to contemplate that which they call to mind. Philosophy acts as an essential nudge to help remind the psyche that its Eros will not be satisfied by objectification of beautiful things, but only in ecstatic union with beauty itself. So we see the rational, mediated cognition working in tandem with ecstatic or immediate cognition to reintegrate the self. So, and this is, I think, is how I kind of keep going back to this. But to anyone, if anyone, the question comes to mind of why not just a pure mindfulness? Why don't we simply try to submerge or immerse ourselves into the power of now, if you like? This is the question. This is, I think, the answer, that a true reintegration of the psyche involves these two essential elements of human nature, the mediate and immediate forms of cognition working with one another, and not simply the repression of one by the other. Anyway, so this, I think, is all fine, except it brings us back to this other problem I mentioned in the last two episodes. It seems to take us back to this position of, in a way, finding Plato's myth of a fall of the psyche from heaven and its long quest to return there, in a way kind of impenetrable. What I mean is, if we can't understand Plato as talking about an earlier stage in our natural lives, then how really are we to understand him? Like what? How are we to bring sense out of this image? Put another way, if we can't understand our quest as a return to infancy, what are we to understand it as a return to? Why should we see ourselves as striving to return to something rather than to get to a higher state than before? And also, if we can't see Plato's myth about not being merely about a return to infantile consciousness, does this mean this idea of infantile consciousness should play no role in interpreting it at all? Do we now need to totally dispense with it? Do we need, in other words, to reject Freud entirely here? Or can something of what he says be in some way integrated into our interpretation without doing damage to Plato's beautiful myth and unforgettable myth? I actually think it can, and not only that, I think it should be, if we really want to get as much as we can from Plato and allow ourselves to be, if I can put it this way, lifted up by Plato as much as possible. If we want Plato to fully come alive for us today in the 21st century. That's what I'll be taking a look at next time. I hope you can join me then, and until then, thanks for watching.